Plato said, "Laws are partly formed for the sake of good men, in order to instruct them how they may live on friendly terms with one another, and partly for the sake of those who refuse to be instructed, though spirit cannot be subdued or softened or hindered from plunging into evil." So, today in Europe, Plato may recognize the great need to respect the rule of law. After 70 years of living on friendly terms, it seems there are those who again refuse to be instructed and therefore risk destabilizing that peace for the sake of national idealism.
There are not only economic problems in Europe, but it's also moral crisis. The fact that in some countries there's a problem with the rule of law, there's a problem with democracy.
All our member states are democratic ones, and rule of law is deeply rooted in our tradition, in our political culture. But of course, concerning Poland in the moment, I'm a little bit nervous what's going on there.
Poland by itself may not bring Europe back to the door of destruction, but Poland's aggressive pushback against the European Union carries with it a risk of contagion, where the rule of law is gradually ignored and loses all value.
The Polish government is putting into question the role of the Constitutional Court and is even not ready to accept decisions of the Constitutional Court, and that cannot function. So this Constitutional Court has to play an independent role, and the government of Poland has to respect that.
When you look at the rule of law, is it being applied fairly enough, firmly enough across Europe?
It is never applied fairly enough. It's always a matter of a challenge. That's why we have the rule of law. It's a paradox. You have the rule of law in order to secure that people adhere to the rule of law. And that's an ongoing process. But we have some problems in Europe today. We have some political leaders that in some way is not able to give priority to the rule of law.
In April, in a non-binding resolution, MEPs called on the Polish authorities to fully implement the Venice Commission's recommendations on the ability of Poland's Constitutional Tribunal to uphold its constitution and guarantee respect for the rule of law. MEPs say that actions taken by the Polish government and the President of the Republic of Poland have led to the effective paralysis of the Constitutional Tribunal, which poses a danger to democracy, human rights and the rule of law.
When you look to some countries, Hungary, Poland, there are problems. Let's face them. It's certainly not a solution to deny them and to say, oh, we close our eyes. Because we cannot play a role, a geopolitical role, towards other parts of the world if we don't apply our own principles inside the Union.
In January, the Commission launched an inquiry to determine if Poland had breached the EU's democratic standards, focusing specifically on the new government's attempts to reform Poland's constitutional court. Adopted in 2014, this is the first time the rule of law framework has been used. It can lead to the suspension of Poland's voting rights at the European Council, the so-called nuclear option.
In principle, the EU legislation wants to spread best practices to all member states, but in reality, what we have seen in the last years is that the status quo in some centralized countries is rejecting systematically this European law.
Following talks in Warsaw last week between Franz Timmermans, first Vice President of the European Commission, and the Polish Prime Minister, the Commission decided not to launch a formal procedure against the Polish government's current plans. Poland's Deputy Foreign Minister, Konrad Szymański, had said Warsaw was open to show signs of compromise, but Jarosław Kaczyński, leader of the ruling Law and Justice Party, condemned the Commission's procedure, saying it is a non-treaty procedure, a made-up one, and it can be challenged in the Court of Justice of the European Union at any moment. What do we need in terms of instruments of enforcement?
I think first of all, you need to be more active to use the legal instruments we have. Meaning that if you have a feeling or a suspicion that something is not compatible with the rule of law, let's not make politics out of it. Let's make it be a part of a legal process.
The new EU rule of law framework is not designed to be triggered by individual breaches of fundamental rights or by miscarriage of justice. The main purpose of the framework is to address the threats to the rule of law which are of a systemic nature, such as constitutional structure, separation of powers, and the independence or impartiality of the judiciary.
Many colleagues described, when we discussed on Viktor Orban and Hungary, this Article 7 as the big bomb in the tool case of the European Union. And I would say that so it would be better to agree in a dialogue on a democratic process. I hope it works in Poland because this would help the next conflicts and would help also maybe when we discuss, for example, on Spain, where I would say the rights for demonstrations, for public protests are not really the best ones.
Poland isn't the only country testing the letter and spirit of European law. In December, Hungary was denounced by the European Parliament in a non-legislative resolution for recent Hungarian government measures rendering rules which unjustifiably criminalize refugees, migrants and asylum seekers. The European Parliament also said the Hungarian government uses xenophobic rhetoric linking migrants to social problems or security risks.
Since the discussions with Viktor Orban, we developed this rule of law mechanism, which is a kind of tool to deal with a very difficult situation in between Brussels, the EU Council and a single member state. And so in Poland, for the first time, we now apply this mechanism.
How do Italians perceive Poland and the rule of law in Poland? Is this something which concerns them?
No, I wouldn't say that. If we speak on a general public, Poland and other countries that are more popular, like Hungary, they're not object of general debate. Of course, within a stricter circle and people concerned specifically by press freedom, Hungary is much well known than Poland because there was a sort of relation between Silvio Berlusconi and Orban, and so this subject was widespread by the Italian media.
Parliament said Hungary carried the risk of contagion, not least because many argued that Hungary's premier, Viktor Orban, had been treated too leniently because of his attachment to the EPP, the largest group in the European Parliament.
Unfortunately, the EPP encouraged Mr. Orban, and I think that was a mistake because we all are bound to what is laid down in the treaties. And the treaties clearly say in Article 2 what our common values are and that they are the basis of proceeding with the European project.
Spain is drawing strong criticism too. Its introduction of the so-called gag law was designed to stop public protest, including negative reporting of the Spanish government by the press. Sedition charges against Catalan's pro-independence leaders followed soon after. Democratically elected Catalan politicians now face prison for organising a non-binding referendum on separation from Spain.
2.5 million people voted. And the answer of the Spanish government has been not to recognize any political problem, but to impeach the former Catalan president and 3 Catalan ministers of the government. They may finish in the jail and accused of wasting money so they can lose all their properties. So this is a reaction that reminds the Spanish Inquisition.
The reaction from Madrid towards Barcelona was not what I would like to see. In the same time, I think so also in the Catalonian camp, some people are overdoing and so are also using their European perspective to hide nationalism.
What has happened with the European Commission's politicisation of the excessive budget deficit procedure? Has the Commission itself undermined the rule of law in Europe?
As there is no credibility for sanctions, every member state every year generates the public deficit they want. So there is de facto no rule of EU law.
I think they should be tougher on the budget deficits. A country like France has been postponing its targets all the time, and in the end you're risking the credibility of the legislation. So I think we have a problem here. And this underlines to me how important it is to stick to the rule of law. It's important for economics, it's important for the safety and security of our citizens. The rule of law is what is making European Union a union.
When you look to the treaties, we have not a rule of law system that works. So let's create one. Maybe it's not a good comparison, but let's make a stability and growth pact for democracy and human rights. and let's make a yearly assessment of the rule of law in all the countries of the European Union.
Our laws are not static. They are not instantly formed either. Our laws are the sum of knowledge, culture, and wisdom. Their imperfections are softened by the actions of the courts and of parliaments. But the rule of law must not become a surreal interpretation of national ego, for the result is nightmarish and absurd. US President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the wartime Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, said, "The clearest way to show what the rule of law means to us in everyday life is to recall what has happened when there is no rule of law."